What if I told you that during the Cold War, the United States seriously planned to build a human outpost on the bottom of the ocean? Not a submarine, not a research ship, an actual underwater home where Navy divers would live, sleep, eat, and work for weeks beneath hundreds of feet of seawater. The idea sounded like something pulled straight from a science fiction novel, yet the US Navy spent years and millions of dollars trying to make it a reality. The strangest part is that it actually worked, at least for a while. So why did America believe the ocean floor could become its next great frontier? And what happened that caused the entire project to quietly disappear almost as quickly as it began? Here's the true story. By the 1960s, the Cold War had turned almost every part of the world into a possible battlefield. The sky mattered, space mattered, Europe mattered, the Arctic mattered, and of course, the ocean mattered a lot. American and Soviet submarines were becoming more important. Undersea cables were carrying sensitive communications, and the deep ocean was full of places where lost equipment, wreckage, or military secrets could disappear very quickly. So naturally, the Navy looked at the seafloor and saw more than mud, rocks, darkness, and creatures that looked like they had been designed during a power outage. It saw a frontier. If humans could work underwater for long periods, they could repair equipment, recover objects, assist submarine operations, conduct research, and maybe one day build permanent bases beneath the waves. This was the same era when people were seriously discussing space colonies, nuclear-powered aircraft, and all kinds of wonderfully ambitious ideas that made the 1960s feel like everyone had been given a blank check and a science fiction novel. But there was a major problem. Wanting to control the ocean floor was one thing. Actually putting people down there and keeping them alive was something else entirely. Because before America could claim the seabed as a new frontier, it first had to solve the deeply annoying issue that humans cannot breathe underwater. At the surface, air behaves politely enough. Down below, pressure squeezes everything, and the gases a diver breathes begin dissolving into the body's tissues. This sounds harmless until the diver tries to come back up too quickly, at which point those gases can form bubbles in the blood and tissues. The result is decompression sickness, a condition so unpleasant that even the nickname The Bends sounds like something invented by a cruel gym teacher. This made deep-sea work painfully slow. A diver could spend only a limited amount of time at depth before needing a careful staged return to the surface. The deeper the dive, the longer the decompression. In some cases, the return could take far longer than the actual work. So if the Navy wanted men to repair equipment, recover objects, study the seabed, or support submarine operations, normal diving created a terrible schedule. Go down, work briefly, come back slowly, repeat, and try not to turn a military operation into a very expensive medical emergency. This was the barrier standing between the Navy and its underwater frontier. The ocean floor might have been valuable, mysterious, and strategically tempting, but human bodies came with annoying operating instructions. They needed air, warmth, pressure control, and a very patient exit plan. So the Navy began looking at a strange new possibility. Instead of sending divers down for short visits, what if they simply stayed there? The idea that made Sea Lab possible came from a Navy doctor named Captain George F. Bond, who had spent years studying how the human body behaved under pressure. His work focused on a concept called saturation diving, which sounds like something that should involve a wet sponge, although in this case the sponge was unfortunately a human being. The basic idea was surprisingly simple. When a diver goes deep underwater, gases from the breathing mixture dissolve into the body. After enough time at the same pressure, the body reaches a point where it cannot absorb much more of those gases. At that stage, the diver is considered saturated. And once that happens, staying longer at the same depth does not keep adding more decompression time in the same way. This changed the entire problem. Instead of sending divers down for short jobs and then dragging them through long decompression again and again, the Navy could keep them living under pressure for days or weeks. They could sleep underwater, eat underwater, work underwater, and then go through one long decompression at the end of the mission. For deep sea work, this was a huge breakthrough. Bond's research helped prove that humans could survive extended periods under pressure if the environment was carefully controlled. The breathing gases had to be managed, the temperature had to be watched, the habitat had to remain sealed and stable. In other words, the ocean was willing to allow tenants, but only if the rent was paid in engineering, medical science, and a healthy fear of leaks. With the theory in place, the Navy needed to find out whether saturation diving could work outside a controlled test chamber, where the ocean had opinions of its own and generally expressed them through pressure, darkness, cold water, and poor manners. This led to Sealab 1, the first real attempt to place a small American habitat on the seafloor and keep men living there for more than a brief visit. So, in July 1964, Sealab 1 was lowered off Bermuda to a depth of about 192 feet. Inside were 4 aquanauts: Robert Thompson, Lester Anderson, Sanders Manning, and Bob Barth. Their underwater home was small, pressurized, and very far from comfortable, but comfort was not really the main objective. The Navy wanted to know whether trained men could eat, sleep, communicate, work, and remain healthy while living under the sea. For the next 11 days, the aquanauts carried out tests, monitored equipment, and proved that the habitat could support human life at depth. Everything had to be watched carefully. The air mixture, temperature, pressure, communications, and power systems all mattered, because in an underwater house, even a minor failure can become the sort of household problem that does not end with calling a plumber. The mission was planned to last longer, but a tropical storm forced the Navy to bring it to an early end. Even so, Sealab 1 had already done what it needed to do. It showed that humans could live on the ocean floor for days at a time, and once that became possible, the next question became much bigger. Could they actually work there? Sealab 2 was a larger habitat, better equipped, and designed for a much more ambitious mission. Instead of one short stay, Sealab 2 used several teams of aquanauts who rotated through the habitat over a period of weeks. Their job was to test whether underwater living could support real work. They carried out experiments, maintained equipment, studied the surrounding environment, and practiced tasks that might one day help with Navy operations. The most famous aquanaut involved was Scott Carpenter, one of America's original Mercury astronauts. His presence gave the project a very strange kind of space-age glamour, because apparently exploring one deadly environment was not enough for some people. Carpenter spent about a month underwater, which helped show how seriously the Navy was treating this project. The aquanauts even communicated with President Lyndon Johnson from beneath the sea, giving the whole experiment the feeling of a national achievement hiding under several hundred feet of Pacific water. Sealab 2 also used a trained dolphin named Tuffy, who helped carry supplies and messages between the habitat and the surface. This sounds like a detail invented by a screenwriter who had too much coffee, but it really happened. By the end of the mission, the Navy had learned something important. People could live underwater, work underwater, and adapt to the strange routine of life beneath the waves, which meant the idea was no longer just survival, it was starting to look operational. For the military, the ocean was already a huge part of Cold War strategy. Submarines were carrying nuclear missiles, naval forces were watching each other across the world, and deep water was becoming a place where important machines, weapons, and secrets could vanish. If the Navy could place trained men near the seafloor for days or weeks, those men could help with salvage, submarine rescue, equipment repair, and scientific surveys. They could also learn how humans behaved in deep, isolated environments, which was useful knowledge in an era when both space and the deep ocean seemed ready to swallow anyone careless enough to enter them. There was also a bigger idea behind it. Long-duration underwater living suggested that the United States might one day operate beneath the ocean with the same confidence it operated on land, at sea, and in the air. This did not mean cities with glass domes, smiling families, and someone trying to open a seafood restaurant at 200 feet. The Navy's interest was far more practical. It wanted access, endurance, and control. And during the Cold War, access mattered. Any environment that could hide submarines, cables, listening devices, wreckage, or resources became strategically important. The bottom of the ocean was just no longer a place ships accidentally sank into. It was becoming a frontier. So once Sealab 2 worked, ambition naturally grew. The next test would go deeper, become more complex, and ask far more from the men and machines involved. By the time Sealab 3 was prepared, the Navy was no longer satisfied with proving that men could live underwater at roughly 200 feet. The next mission was planned for a much greater depth, around 610 feet off San Clementine Island in California. At that level, everything became more serious. The pressure was far higher, the equipment had to perform with very little room for error, and any small repair could turn into a full engineering argument with the Pacific Ocean. Sealab 3 itself was a modified version of the earlier Sealab 2 habitat, which already made the project complicated. Before the aquanauts could properly begin the mission, leaks and technical problems had to be addressed. That meant sending divers down to inspect and repair the habitat in extremely demanding conditions. Deep underwater, even simple tasks become slow, awkward, and exhausting. A tool can be difficult to handle. A hose can become a problem. A routine check can suddenly feel like the ocean is reading the instruction manual upside down. During one of these repair dives in February 1969, Aquanaut Barry Cannon lost his life. He had been part of the team sent down to fix problems with the habitat before the main mission could continue. His death devastated the program and forced the Navy to confront the risks that came with pushing human beings deeper for longer periods. After Sealab 3, the mood changed completely. The dream of permanent underwater operations had once seemed bold, futuristic, and almost inevitable. Now it carried the weight of a fatal accident, rising technical doubts, and a difficult question the Navy could no longer avoid: how much danger was this underwater frontier really worth? After the loss of Barry Cannon and the problems surrounding Sealab 3, the Navy launched investigations into what happened and carefully reviewed the future of the entire program. The accident alone did not answer every question, but it forced military planners to look much more closely at whether permanent underwater habitats was still the best path forward. At the same time, technology was changing remarkably quickly. During the 1960s, keeping people underwater had often seemed like the only practical way to carry out extended work on the seafloor. By the end of the decade, engineers were developing increasingly capable remotely operated systems, improved underwater vehicles, and better diving equipment. Machines could perform more tasks than before, and unlike human divers, they did not require oxygen, decompression schedules, or somewhere to sleep after a long day's work. There was also the question of cost. Maintaining an underwater habitat demanded ships, support crews, medical specialists, engineers, life support systems, and constant monitoring. Every mission required months of planning before a single diver entered the water. For military leaders balancing budgets across submarines, aircraft carriers, aircraft, and countless other programs, underwater colonies gradually became harder to justify. Public attention also drifted elsewhere. In July 1969, only a few months after Sealab 3, millions of people watched Apollo 11 land on the moon. Space exploration captured headlines around the world, while deep ocean habitats quietly faded from view. The Navy officially ended the Sealab program later that year. The dream of permanent military habitats beneath the sea had reached further than many people thought possible. But by then, the future seemed to belong to a different combination of technology, one where humans and machines would increasingly work together instead of building neighborhoods on the ocean floor. But what do you think? Did America abandon an idea that was simply decades ahead of its time? Share your thoughts in the comments section below, leave a like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more amazing videos like this one.